welcome to our next talk about LLMs in healthcare. And pleased to introduce you, Julia. And yeah, I actually have no idea about what you're going to tell us today. So I'm very, very interested in seeing.
Well, I hope to fill those gaps. Thank you so much, Michael. So this talk is not going to be about the capabilities of AI or how to implement them. I believe many of you know more about that than I do. What I'm going to talk about instead is the human experiences that they can bring to life. My name is Julie-Wolfthorn-Str. I'm a staff product designer at a company called Cree, which is one of Europe's largest telehealth provider, a digitally enabled healthcare provider. We are present in some of the largest countries in Europe, and we provide digital consultations as well as having clinics where people can seek care in person. And I've spent the past couple of years contemplating and crafting and prototyping how emerging technologies can fit within healthcare, because as we know, there's a lot of very small quirks, but also giant challenges to be solved. But before we look at those experiences, let me give you some context on what the state looks like today and what the challenges are ahead. And I'm sure I don't need to introduce the problems in healthcare at large, whether you are having a first-person perspective as a patient, or whether you're someone who's working with technology to make society fairer and more equitable every day. I'm sure that you're familiar with problems like an aging society combined with increasing disease burden, chronic disease burden, combined with a constant shortage of healthcare staff. It's not really a wonder that access to healthcare today is not even in the developed countries of the world, let alone in the developing ones. And I think before we talk about any technology, it is just good practice to acknowledge that no matter how transformative a new piece of technology is, it's never enough to rely on it to solve absolutely critical and complex systemic challenges, not on their own. There's so much more that might be necessary there. However, there are opportunities that we can discover for ourselves to find opportunities to solve for with technology. So for instance, if you imagine the experience of a patient, I'm sure that we've all been in the shoes of the patients before. Healthcare can very much feel like a maze. So you arrive, you don't really know what you're looking for. It's hard to find the care that you need, but you don't really know how to start to find your way to it. It feels like a maze, really. The other side of the coin is that of the care professional. And since demand for their skills are nearly infinite, it can feel very overwhelming at times to try to help everyone who needs your help. And that's also proven by data. For instance, if we take our survey results from the UK with general practitioners, 80% of them say that workload in and of itself has a negative impact on their mental health. So the burnout is real. If we zoom in on primary care alone, acknowledging that healthcare is broader than that, simply put, there's two quite large challenges that technology can support. The first one is communication. The communication in the sense that you as a patient needs to express what you need help with, and you need someone to tell it to. And from a care professional's perspective, they need to be able to communicate advice and decisions in a helpful way. And the other problem is navigation. So navigating patients through a care journey that will get them the right care at the right time. And you might be asking very fairly, aren't these problems that we've already solved before? It seems that we have fantastic search engines, we have medical chatbots in our pockets, and we have all the information that we need coming out of the best university hospitals in the world. How come that patients are not fully informed, and how come that clinicians are not state-of-the-art as they are already? And I would argue that these problems are very much here with us today still. And that's partially because we are humans, and our biases and our emotions are very strong and very powerful, and they make it difficult to turn, no matter how useful the information is, it into actions that are the correct ones and do it consistently. We often resort to mental shortcuts, to recency bias, to availability bias to make decisions, especially when it comes to our health. And so it comes down to this very important role, which is we need the guidance of an objective and knowledgeable figure, despite this abundance of information that surrounds us. And that figure is not an AI, it is a doctor, and it's most likely going to stay a doctor for a very, very long time. There's a good reason why healers throughout history have always had a broader role than just someone who's providing you with medication. Even today, if we take the example of French family practitioners, family doctors, their role transcends that of a doctor. They are more like lifelong advisors that know you well beyond just you as a medical record. And that kind of broader role is really important to acknowledge when we are talking about technology within healthcare as well. So what happens when you see a doctor? What is it that doctors can do that us as lay people cannot? They go through a number of steps, of course, very quickly, maybe not even consciously, starting with interpreting data, interpreting large sets of medical knowledge that they might have learned in university, combined with the clinical information that you provide them when you're there and you're asking for their support and decisions. They decide what is important and what is not so important in the moment. They contextualize that information. They look at your social background and your medical history and decide what is relevant and what is not relevant from all that information that is available. They estimate likelihoods of different conditions that might be causing your symptoms, or likelihoods of a certain treatment method working better or worse for you. And also, they estimate risk of going down in one of many paths for you. And based on that, they give advice. Based on the clinical decisions they make, they formulate that in a way that you are willing to listen to it and understand it. And then everything that they've heard and everything they've considered and everything they've decided is then documented by them to make sure that what happened within their care is visible on your records for the next mission that might come around to help you. That's quite a few steps, but the really important thing here is that they do this due to the mounting pressures on healthcare very efficiently. We're talking about 11 minutes at CRE per patient that is spent on one case. That is not a lot of time. That means that on a normal workday, they go through this cognitive process about 35 times, which is a lot. And with increasing patient to clinician ratios in almost every country in Europe, there's a lot of pressure to become and stay efficient. But the catch is that they're accountable. They're accountable for the decisions that they make and the advice that they give you. And that is not to be taken for granted. So that's a very tall order, looking at all the things that a doctor does just in a few minutes every time they meet a patient. So imagine, and now we don't have to imagine any longer because we have them. Imagine that there's something new that enters the scene, and that new thing is a machine that is able to understand and master our operating system, our human operating system, which is the spoken and the written word. And what fascinates me about large language models specifically is how quickly they've managed to learn to understand what we mean as humans and what matters to us as humans. And why are we talking about this in the context of healthcare? You might be asking, is this really the biggest problem to solve? I would argue that primary care hinges on the effective use of language. There is just no way around it. And the ironic fact is there's so much that is also lost in translation in healthcare between the different parties speaking different languages. Have you ever been in a situation When you needed to see a care professional, you prepared all the right talking points. You knew what you're going to say. You knew that what you're going to ask. You had everything prepared in your head in a very concise manner. However, when you were right there and then, you didn't manage to get those across. And if you know what it means, I can tell you that almost every patient struggles with that. According to our clinicians, patients have a hard time cohesively and concisely describe what they need help with and what their symptoms are, which is why the largest portion of any consultation is actually spent on questioning the patient, not on the other steps, just questioning the patient, getting the right information out. And it turns out that language has impact in both directions. There are studies that are proving that a good relationship and the communication style and the rapport between a physician and a doctor has a positive impact on health outcomes, which is intuitive. Now we know that there's evidence proving it, because the more you trust someone, the more likely you're going to listen to their advice, and therefore the more likely that the treatment plan or medication plan will actually work for you. So simply put, language builds trust, and trust is essential to get positive health outcomes in healthcare today. And so with that, we actually arrived at a key point here, a key point of describing what is the opportunity for technology within healthcare today to increase and improve access to healthcare, to increase the efficiency of our care professionals, and to maintain this delicate balance of trust between care providers and their patients. So, knowing how delicate this is, what roles should we assign to large language models or AI in general? What can they take on, and what should they take on? Those might be two separate questions, but nonetheless, they both feed into the same decision. And in order to answer that, let's look back at those tasks that a doctor does. Very high level, but helpful for a framework, from communication to documentation and everything that happens in primary care. There's a very interesting pattern that started to emerge with recent changes. If you think about the past decade, or 2 decades even, what we've seen is that AI was imagined as a tool that you can use to offload the data-driven, heavy lifting that today a clinician does, and let the machine do those things. Things like helping navigate patients to the right care facility based on their symptoms, based on their availability, or thinking about interpreting data, using AI to interpret large sets of data, especially when they come from different sources and many different disparate sources, to think about interoperability and other challenges. Or to use AI to not only estimate, but accurately predict the likelihood of different treatment scenarios and the effect that they can have on your health, and predict which treatment you should be getting. And I do think that we've made strides. The industry has made huge strides to use AI for these tasks. But if you look closer, large language models are not the right tool and not very competent in doing these steps. So what are they actually competent at? What are the opportunities for us? It's everything else. Everything else that we thought that we will have to wait far longer for to use technology's help with. Large language models can smoothen communication between patients and their clinicians. They can also help contextualize the information, and that's based on all the early research already from 2022 that shows that large language models are able to identify clinical concepts from a text, even if they weren't pre-trained for it, which means there's a huge potential there to use large language models to infer which piece of data matters for a certain patient case. When it comes to giving advice, it's a tricky balance, because on the one hand, large language models are great at packaging information in a way that is very understandable, very actionable, very personalized, and do that at scale. However, on the other hand, they don't have the holistic view of a patient, so they still need the guardrails for clinicians. to be able to know what right advice to give. And there's one more thing there, which is who is the right role, who takes the role of delivering that advice. And at the moment, we don't have proof that AI is as effective at delivering advice in a trusted manner as clinicians can do. And finally, the competence of large language models that our clinicians are most excited about is their ability to pick up on all the administrative burden of documentation to be able to get some help in doing all the paperwork, or today it's also digital work. And of course, we need to love efficiency. When it comes to large language models efficiency and their impact in making our healthcare systems more efficient, it seems very promising, even compared to the fastest clinicians. Large language models are remarkably quick at performing certain tasks. So that looks really great. But when it comes to accountability, the clinicians still are in the driving seat. And that does not make our job actually that much easier. It would be easier to think, oh, if the clinician and the human makes the final decision, it's all good because the technology doesn't have to work that well. But that's not the case. We've run UX research in multiple countries, and what came out consistently is that the only way doctors and other clinicians will adopt AI is, on the one hand, if they perform things that are aligned with their own purpose, as in treating patients in their ways, and also only if they don't drop their quality and safety standard. So actually, the bar is pretty high for LLMs to produce good work, for them to be really taken seriously by the decision makers or the clinicians. So what would the future look like if we had large language models at the disposal of our clinicians? I'm going to show you a handful of prototypes that we are building and shipping and piloting in small scale, and the experiences that come out of them. As a patient, you can express your needs, symptoms that you have, or whatever you need help with in your own language, in natural language, without the time pressure of having to do it in only a few minutes, and also without feeling like you need to fill out a lot of tedious forms. On the other side, clinicians can get a summary of what the patient has reported, written up in their own language, and they can read this summary before seeing the patient. So when they actually spend time together, they can fully focus on what the patient is saying, and they can also come into a consultation far more prepared. And when the consultation happens, when there is that precious face time between clinicians and patients, they can fully focus on what the patient is saying and dedicate their full attention to it without having to type it, without them having to type in the meantime, because under the hood, the AI is at work, capturing everything that has been said. And everything that has been said then is turned into the format that is most useful for clinicians. So think about the medical note that goes into your medical record, where clinicians can get suggestions based on the transcript of the conversation and insert them in their note and potentially cut down administrative time, which today at CRE takes 20% of their total time, which is a lot. And even the things that you might have mentioned, like allergies, warnings, that need to be captured in the record, but they might not be relevant for the acute problem that you're seeking care with today, can be suggested for the clinician to capture in your record. So then when the next time you come, you don't have to repeat your whole life story again. And finally, the actions or next steps that you have agreed to with your doctor during the call will not be forgotten, because the AI can actually remind clinicians to complete things and even pre-fill those certificates or any other documentation that needs to be created. And it might not look like much, but we are talking about tens of thousands of certificates created each month just at CRE, because every single every second consultation, excuse me, every second consultation requires one of these very standard forms. So these small steps can actually lead to quite a lot of impact. But beyond talking about the feature and what it does and the benefit that they can bring, I think it's also important to stop for a moment and think about, especially as designers and people building technology, of how these experiences could feel like and should feel like. And in order to answer that question, we needed to go back to our own design principles, that have been governing the way we've been building products, professional products for clinicians and also for patients. And these were the following four. Thoughtfully assist speaks about the need to anticipate user needs, to anticipate what our clinicians might be doing and might need to get help with. Need for speed is about helping our clinicians perform their best work in the quickest possible way, saving them time. Flexible, not fixed, acknowledges that there's actually no straight paths in patient care, and our tools that we provide for clinicians will have to match all the numerous ways in which patients' journeys might look like and all the actions that need to be taken to manage them. And finally, safeguarded is about us building products in a way that allows our clinicians to safeguard their patients within their own care, because we're all driven by the same principles of quality and safety. But these are very general, right? They don't necessarily tell you how to build AI technology into your tools. So we needed to take a closer look at how these principles can look like when building large language model driven and powered functionality into these tools. So let's take the example of a sick note, for instance. You might have been expecting to see something like a generic medical chatbot that you can prompt to do whatever you might need to get help with. Something that is quite good at a lot of things, if not everything that you might need help with. But instead, what we consciously chose to do is to help clinicians complete the tasks that they need to complete anyway, and do that very effectively, because we expect those tasks to be challenging for them and also very repetitive. And so we chose to use LLMs in a very specialized way. And so our takeaway is to help users complete very specific tasks very well before generalizing the purpose of AI. You might have also caught that I did not show a transcript. I did not show you any transcript on a user interface of a clinician. And that is also a specific choice, because looking at the transcript is not the end goal. We don't want our clinicians to spend extra time and extra effort having to format something that we've captured from the conversation, but still not really going all the way and helping them all the way complete their documentation. And instead, we went for a strategy where we can then package that information that the transcript now has into formats that are helping them complete their tasks, which are mandatory and are necessary for them. That's also a takeaway for us, which is to decrease interaction costs. And when I talk about interaction costs, I'm not talking about the cost of API capacity or the number of tokens that it will take to perform some of these actions and get them done by an AI. I'm talking about the time and effort it takes for our users to interact with the technology to complete a task. And we need to try to decrease that as much as possible. When we suggest actions to clinicians, we want to make sure that those suggestions appear exactly at the place and the time when they're most likely to act on them as well. So right below where you would be starting other actions, such as write a referral or write a sick note or create a prescription, that's when the suggestions appear. And exactly that's where they're most likely to become useful and be acted on. And that is because we need to put and use AI exactly where our users already are, and make sure that these tools also fit within their workflow that they are executing in. And finally, and probably most importantly, even though we need to decrease the interaction cost of the tools that we build, we also need to make sure that those that make the final decision, and in this case the clinician, can have a fact check to make sure they know what they're signing off on. When they are receiving suggestions, every single one needs to be consciously and explicitly accepted. And that interaction is very important so that they are pushed to review before they sign. And that takeaway is to let our users make the final call since they are in the driving seat. So to recap our takeaways, it's help complete specific tasks very well, decrease interaction costs, use AI wherever our users already are, and let our users make the final call. Before I close, I would love to share some reflections based on the past year of experimenting, prototyping, and shipping large language models powered tools. There have been a couple of them, and I selected a few key ones, which I think are relevant even beyond healthcare and even beyond building tools for professionals. One of the first ones is to work bottom up. I think as designers, if there's any designers in the audience, I'm sure you can relate. Sometimes it's incredibly tempting to start visualizing your wildest dreams of how the future will look like with technology and especially AI in it. But I would caution against that and rather use the opportunity to understand what the current technology is able to do and prototype with that, because then you understand the limits of it and also the potential of it. Because sometimes those behaviors that might be blocking you from solving a specific problem with the technology might disappear in one day and move in leaps. The capabilities just move so fast, but there's other problems that might linger around for longer, and you need to be aware of that when you're solving problems, be it reliability or the usefulness or the humanness of the advice that the LLM gives you. The second one is experimentation just got easier. And that's thanks to the conversational interface that many LLMs now afford. You're able to, whether you're a designer, a writer, or anyone else, even without coding knowledge, you're able to start experimenting with prompts and test different use cases very quickly. And actually working with AI now is becoming more of a cross-functional effort and not only an engineering task. And that just makes iterations much, much faster. And it also puts more of the responsibility on designers and writers to really work with the details of how the AI works. The catch there, though, is that testing just got harder. It has never been so difficult to reproduce results, whether you're testing the tone of voice of a digital assistant or whether you are trying to reproduce the usefulness or the humanness or the relevance or the correctness of the suggestions that come out of a large language model. Because there's always this element of surprise, there is this this hard to imagine part where there's just a lot of variability in the results. And that's tricky because you can never be 100% sure of the robustness of your solution, but you still need to keep trying and keep testing so that you maximize whatever you can before putting something live. And that actually ties very well into the third reflection and last reflection, is that your AI will need allies. That means that your users will need to have to want to see the machine and the AI succeed. Because of this variability in the results, they'll need to be very vigilant and they'll need to be able to look over the potential mistakes of AI, and they can correct for them as long as they believe in it. And the important thing here for me is to also expose users as early as possible to AI tools so that they can start having perspective and build a vision where they can also see these tools becoming very, very useful for them and believe in the future where these can become part of our everyday lives. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and for coming. And I would like to thank my team. Andy? And if you want to, and if you're working on similar things or just simply interested in the topic, please do get in touch. I would love to have a chat with you also after the talk. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions?
Firstly, thank you very much. It's really topic. I was just wondering, I'm assuming you have a product pre-AI, then you have a market on this, so now you're obviously developing the AI. So how are you running the two streams, or are you saying we're not doing this anymore, we're going to worry to this class of AI, or is it still 50-50?
That's a great question. It's not 50-50. It's less. I think I can't say the exact percentage, but we do have experimental streams that sometimes launch new use cases into the product, which is being used every day. Thinking about Cree Pro, which is the tool for clinicians or the patient app, but it has to go through thorough testing before it hits any of our users. But it is not 50-50 and also not 100% focused towards only AI-enabled functionality, because there's still a lot out there that needs to be solved. But they can be very core to what the product is in the future, so we need to get started early.
You label this as, for example, when you send it out to your customers and in real life, you label this as powered by AI?
Yes. We are both mandated to do so, and also we want to do so. Actually, surprisingly, our clinicians have been very, very excited about the potential of using that, but they want to know when, and they want to know the difference. And one of the things that came out of that research, for instance, is that as long as they feel that they have responsibility over the final output, they're totally fine with seeing suggestions and have AI be there. But of course, I can also see that the AI functionality needs to prove its own value and worth to them. And that can only happen when it is. And also similarly to patients, patients are aware and they can even powers digital assistant. Yeah. 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 A great question, and that's actually one of the headaches throughout this whole process. Is how do you leverage the feedback that you can get from clinicians on the quality of what they've received from an AI suggestion. So what we do today is we have a really tight-knit group of pilot testers who are giving us feedback in almost real time, feeding us with information or even flagging up certain use cases or certain scenarios and situations that are not being handled good enough and well enough. And so those sort of go back into the lab so that we can immediately know about that. Now, this would not work if we scaled it too quickly. So our approach is to scale very slowly, put it out quickly, test with a small group of users, and then scale relatively slowly once we have more reliability. But then there's the other level, which is one thing is what your user says, and the other thing is what, from an objective medical quality perspective, is good enough. And so we're doing the two at the same time to have our medical quality professionals also review what has been generated and whether they were correctly used. So both need to happen.
A bit related to that, so you said you made some conscious decision as well about limiting this one. And how do you measure success in this case? How do you know it's a right decision? What are the metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the ultimate measure of success here is not so much adoption, but efficiency gains and the quality of the and so the only way we can do that is through objective testing, not only rely on the sort of input of what looks correct. And then just like with any other medical quality question that happens outside of product, that we know that the ultimate output is right, whether it is any other medical, they go through some testing.
That's some great doctors.
But because, exactly, but because we are going from small scale to larger scale slowly, this testing will be very independent of it. And at the same time, the other measure of success is adoption, maybe not the first one, but how likely are companies to accept the suggestions. If that in and of itself has a qualitative factor, if you don't accept it, it's probably either not relevant or something.
The small, don't you have a small sample as well to start testing?
Absolutely. You're completely right. You need to have a certain sample size for it to reflect what if we were to scale this to a larger scale. The first and foremost thing in a pilot test is to make sure that the perceived quality by your users is that is. In this setup with large language models, proving statistical significance the first time is probably not the most perceiving it, and if they pass it, then you can move to like. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah.
Is some captured information also available?
Yeah.
If you have cancer or an elderly relative, that would also be super interesting.
Yeah. It's a great question. So today, for instance, if you're using a patient tab and in this case that it's the medical records are not included there. That's partially reasons. Not every product is allowed to store medical records, but there's also national database where the medical note be accessed. Now, depending on the information that is generated, let's say the suggestions for a medical note are not very relevant to a patient, rather the final output. Or if you think about the chat conversation you might be having with a nurse or doctor, and also with a digital assistant, is then indeed stored in their app so that they can read it.
Question. So I know that medical data is especially well regarded by GDPR and everything, so there's lots of compliance to be done.
Yes.
And what are the biggest hoops that you had to jump into for? Yeah, I guess you have private instances or.
That's a great question. So what you need to do first is to make sure that the patient data, even if it's very limited, as you can see, most of these diagnosed, you were reading through your record, that they are not used for training of the original model, and there are contracts in place for that commercially available model. Microsoft, they cover for that so that the data isn't used. But of course, like with any other software vendor that you're using in their stack, they need to do the same steps of evaluating whether they are compliant with Europe. That's it. But it's, I think it's, what is
Another question has, so when you talk about healthcare, there are two other big actors there. And what's the impact on what you do? How do you deal with them?
right? So that's like separate. Insurance companies, I can't really speak for that because as a healthcare provider, owning our own proprietary software platform, and also in countries in the Nordics, in France, UK, patients are public. And so insurance companies at that point, they don't have as much. at the products that we build. However, there are new partnerships and these factors being one.
But in the sense that they still decide what can be used.
That's true. But the AI work that the research and itself that actually help the administration. The regulator is also very interesting. That's one of the trickiest things, balance science and innovating, and of course there is a natural slowdown when it comes to this. The use cases that we've looked at today are purely administrative here, which means that if they were to be diagnosed in any way, which they are not, that would be a completely different challenge. But it's a one. Thank you so much for coming.